All right, well, let's welcome back Dr. Susan Mwangi to the show once more. I think the last time we were having a conversation here, we had another Susan on the set as well, who was Ngoiri Migwi. She's doing well out there, so shout out to Ngoiri Migwi, and please do come back to, as Dr. Susan has availed herself once more to have this conversation. Climate change, is it the biggest threat that humanity is facing at the moment, and how prepared are we? Carbon taxation, a very hot conversation has happened for the past 1 week, online and offline as well. What is carbon taxation? Is this more tax from the government of Kenya Kwanza to us citizens, or how exactly does this play with climate resilience and climate adaptation? Let me welcome Dr. Susan to the show. You're a lecturer of archaeology, history, and political science. All of this in one packaged in one robust experience that you've had over the past years. How does this all bring us to climate change now?
Thank you so much, Ukenye.
Yes.
I remember the last time we were here, we were discussing radicalization, if I'm not wrong, and
yes,
women.
And women empowerment.
And
yes.
women empowerment. And I hope you've been doing well, as I can see.
Yes, I am prospering.
I can see.
I hope it shows.
I can see. Yeah. Welcome, viewers. I am happy to be here once more to discuss a topic that is very hot currently, especially after the African Leaders Summit that was held in Nairobi. It was one of its kind. It hasn't happened elsewhere in Africa. It was the first one where African leaders have decided to come together and speak with one voice about African situation as relates to the climate crisis. The climate crisis has been there since the 1960s and well before that. I'm a lecturer in history, so I'll take you back to history.
Okay.
And at the time, the debate was about global warming. Today, I don't know whether we are going to talk about global warming or we are going to talk about global heating and global melting, because the situation has changed. As we stand today, the world is experiencing a catastrophe that is going to affect all of us. So we are moving away from the debate on Africa as a victim to a situation where we are talking about the potential of Africa to drive the debate on climate change.
Right.
Richard, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They're saying that it is the single greatest threat that humanity is facing at the moment. I know we have nuclear war, a threat of nuclear war, and many other like terrorism. Is climate change actually the biggest threat that we're facing? Is it that serious?
Thank you so much, Richard. I will tell you why we say that climate change is the biggest catastrophe, the greatest threat that humankind has. In 1968, Garrett Hardin wrote a book on the tragedy of the commons. And in the tragedy of the commons, he talks about how climate is a common factor for all of us. The environment is a common factor to all of us. And so once the environment is affected, it does not respect any boundaries. If there is a climate change issue, if there is a drought, if there is receding waters and oceans, it affects all of us. So whether you are a polluter, as it were, or you're not a polluter, that climate change affects all of us. Because if the African continent, even if 93% of the African continent has renewable energy, that does not translate to the other continents. And once the other continents are affected, it definitely affects all of us. So climate change is the biggest catastrophe that the world is facing today. And if it is not checked, it will mark the end of humanity. Yeah.
Right. African cities here, I was taking a look at a few numbers. African cities and urban centers are going to be growing rapidly, and they're saying that by 2050, we'll be home to 1 billion people. So poverty, urbanization, inequality, all of these things are going to be hazards and going to be hotspots across the continent. And the question now I want to know here, do we have the potential and the ambition to be, providers of a global solution to climate change? Does Africa have a space in the provision of solutions?
Thank you so much, Richard. The African Summit that has just been held in Nairobi has actually pronounced itself and said that Africa has the potential, it has the capability, because we have a lot of renewable energy. So even if urbanization and industrialization are taking place at a very high speed, the African continent today as we speak has the greatest amount of resources in terms of water, in terms of wind, in terms of solar. We have a lot of it. If you think about Congo, the DRC Congo, we have the biggest forest. If you talk about Gabon, they have a big forest. If you talk about Kenya, we have geothermal power. If you talk about Ethiopia, we have a lot of green energy. And this green energy can actually be harnessed to be used by the world. And therefore we have the capability, we have the intention, and we also have the potential to provide solutions to climate change.
Right. What key commitments then can we be excited about in this latest Africa Climate Summit? There was a Nairobi declaration that everyone was, looking forward to see the deliberations, the policy frameworks. Are there some key goals that you can outline for us that are going to address this climate change?
Richard, as I sat down and watched the Africa Summit take place in Nairobi, I was excited for two things. That one, it's a first. It's a one of its kind. Being a one of its kind is Africa's commitment to show their potential, to show that they are no longer going to sit back and listen to people discuss them. It's time that Africa discusses challenges and provides solutions to the problems that are facing the world. The period of colonization, that is in the 1800s, it was a discovery that Africa had a lot of potential, and that is why we needed to be colonized. And because there is a new form of a recolonization of our resources, Africans are standing up and saying that we have the potential, we have the solutions, and we are ready to provide the solutions. And that is why they have come up with three main things that we need to celebrate. One, for me, is the debate on fossil fuels. That the fossil fuels that many African countries do not have, because we are only contributors to the tune of 3% only. And for that reason, because our energy is largely green, it therefore means that as we push forward, or as we move forward to make the globe a green globe, Africa has a lot of potential to do that, because we have a lot of energy that we can harness and that can be used. I remember there was a very strong debate on how the resources that we have can actually, we can do what we call carbon credit. And how do we do the carbon credit? That we can actually harness our energies, our resources, to ensure that we sell that energy to the outside world. So three things therefore come to mind. The fossil fuel debate, that we need to have an end to the use of fossil fuels and turn to renewable energy. Which Africa has a lot of. Number two was the debate on the carbon market, which is also very important. Of course, the controversy is the global north wants us to engage in the debate on carbon credits so that they can be buying off. The challenge is the global north will continue emitting the green gases. They will continue emitting, but buy the carbons from those that are not, emitting. But that has a controversial effect. Why do I say that? I say that because it does not mean that we are solving the problem. We are only reducing. And the intention is to get to the net zero. The net zero will require that all of us stop emitting, or try as much as we can to stop emitting, so that the global warming does not become the global heating. And then the most important of those declarations was the investment and the financing. And there were two types of investment that were discussed. One was the investment on adaptation and mitigation. And in adaptation and mitigation, how do we help vulnerable groups to adapt and to become resilient, to build and to strengthen resilience for communities that are suffering most of the vulnerabilities and the vagaries of climate change? So that was one form of financing. The second one was the asset financing, where we are saying instead of compensating, because we can never compensate for what has been lost, can we invest in green energy? And investing in green energy will require a lot of partnerships, private-public partnerships, the global north and the global south. So for me, I felt that was a good discussion on where we move the debate from compensation to investment. And we are investing in mitigation and adaptation, and also investing in asset financing, where we do not just cushion the communities, the vulnerable groups, but we also give finance to countries, especially the African countries, who have a lot of debt to pay currently. So can we cancel the debt and give African countries, finance to be able to ensure that their renewable energy is harnessed to the right direction?
Right, and while we're still speaking financing, I think reparations of the contributions towards climate effects by the global north was also a big conversation here, given that, as you said, that we emit or we contribute a paltry 3% or 3 to 4% thereabout, while the greatest contributors continue to benefit from this system. And there was also, the need for them to honor a commitment in towards climate financing. But before we get into that and to see how resilient, of course, we can be on a local level, as you mentioned, there are vulnerable groups being, the youth, women, and others in parts where, these conversations are not held. We are having these conversations at COP summits, at the Africa Climate Summit, the COP28 is coming up as well. But how do the local vulnerable groups also get to participate in this kind of resilience? So we'll get into that. But since you're also a lecturer of political science, I want to hear from you. There's a need to ring fence these kinds of declarations from geopolitical interests, right? Politics might come into play. We've seen the issues of BRICS and realignment here and there. How then do we still ensure that we are focused on our goal? But first, before we get to those comments from Dr. Susan here, let's get to see here a small piece of story that we have for you. Participant leaders of countries and regional organizations in Africa have signed that Africa Declaration, or the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Change, which was dubbed the Nairobi Declaration, in the just concluded Africa Climate Summit held at KICC. President William Ruto welcomed the groundbreaking declaration as an ultimate answer to global climate change, making calls for financial redefinement, most specifically the liberation of African economies from debt traps set by developed nations. Munene Weru has this report for you.
The inaugural Africa Climate Summit that has just closed curtains at KICC Nairobi birthed a monumental child, the Africa Declaration on Climate Change, dubbed the Nairobi Declaration. His Excellency William Ruto, as the host president of the Maiden Continental Summit, lauded African leaders for agreeing to append to the declaration, pointing out the position of the continent as a pivotal player to climate change efforts, not just in Africa, but across the globe.
As a continent, we have developed our common position, which encapsulates our ambition for socio-economic transformation and our climate action agenda. This position is anchored on the potential that Africa holds to decarbonize the global economy and set the stage for green industrialization throughout the world.
One of the clauses appended in the declaration is climate financing, more specifically the plea to global contributors of climate change to stay true to their pledge of the $100 billion to global climate change efforts. President William Ruto sent out a plea to developed nations to redefine terms of loans and liberate African economies from the yoke of debts in efforts to finance climate change mitigation.
We demand a fair playing ground for our countries to access the investment needed to unlock the potential and translate it into opportunities. We further demand a just multilateral development finance architecture to liberate our economies from odious debt and onerous barriers to necessary financial resources.
Climate financing has taken center stage in the climate mitigation debate, a topic that has well been captured in the appended Nairobi Declaration, And as the visiting leaders exit the KICC in Nairobi, the real climate change mitigation will ensue, that of holding true to agreements made in this year's edition of the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi. Muneneweru, KUTV.
Marks the end of the Africa Climate Summit 2023.
All right, that's the Nairobi Declaration there that will be presented for a call to action in various countries. Heads of state and government already have their copy of the Nairobi Declaration. You can also get yours as well. Check out the AU website. I think it will be easily availed to you there. I'm trying to actually get you what the site is so that you can read yourself what African leaders decided here on how they're going to do capacity building in their own respective capacities. But let's get back to Dr. Susan. Now, before we enter that very important piece that has played there, I was asking about geopolitical interest. Yeah, we are realigning ourselves. I think it was Monday or last week on Friday where the papers were calling President William Ruto a darling of the West. There are geopolitical interests, of course, that we might not get into, but how do we ensure that that is not interfering with the direction we are heading, that this is not just another political bickering that we'll do year in, year out? Is it even possible for us to fence ourselves outside of that geopolitical or those geopolitical interests?
Richard, the world is a small village. And because it's a small village, there is no country, there is no state that can be able to work alone. But that said, even if there is no country that can work alone, there is a strategy that we call selective engagement. And selective engagement means that you pick an ally that best fits you or that agrees with what you stand for. So as a country, I don't know whether you're asking me as a country, Kenya, or as Africa, but I am going to talk generally as Africa. Okay. Because the African continent spoke with one voice, the need for investment as opposed to compensation. Geopolitically, remember that the Western countries, together with China, especially the US and China, are the biggest emitters. And being the biggest emitters, they're the ones that drive the agenda for climate change. They're the ones that are the biggest financiers of the climate change. So that said, therefore, the agenda will be driven by these countries. But the question is, how do African leaders ensure that they tap into the benefits and the funds that are going to be availed by these Western countries, who are the biggest emitters, yet at the same time agreeing to challenge the biggest emitters to commit to the promises that they have made. The United Arab Emirates has committed 450 million for any carbon emission that they have done. Okay. But is it just a mere political talk? How can African countries ensure that the commitments that have been pronounced by the Western countries are honored? That is a big debate and that we can discuss another day. But I'll tell you that if the person that is funding you is the person who is the biggest emitter, your guess is as good as mine. That we will need a lot of commitment as African leaders to speak with one voice. We will also need a lot of lobbying, a lot of networking as African nations to ensure that the Western countries are committed to the debate on climate change. Why? Climate issues do not respect any boundaries and they do not respect anybody. So whether Africans are emitters or they are victims, that is not a debate that we need to engage in anymore. We need to all be committed. The time for action is now. Right. It is, the urgency is so much so that we need to begin talking about these countries committing themselves to ensuring that they commit to what they have promised. Right, and commitment in this kind of stewardship on a local level, every head of state, of course, needs to have an actionable plan in ensuring, earlier on you've mentioned vulnerable groups, the youth, smallholder farmers, who are necessary in this kind of green transition. What do you think then that governments and heads of states can do to empower these vulnerable and indigenous people within their borders? Thank you very much, Richard. When we talk about climate financing and talking about how we are going to cushion, especially the vulnerable groups, one of the things that governments need to commit to is to build resilience to the local communities. And how do they build resilience? That will happen if the local communities are empowered to think about the indigenous knowledge systems that they used traditionally to build resilience around themselves. I will talk about the case of women. We have a research project that we are doing in South Sudan, and one of the things that we are talking with the women is how did they traditionally, how are they able to mitigate against climate shocks? And that requires a lot of investment in terms of money to sensitize them, to educate them, but also to fund them and finance them in small groups. Once they come together, the finances that are going to come out of the carbon credits to the government, and the financing that is going to be given to the government to ensure that there is adaptation, that is finance that can be used to finance the local communities as well, to finance the youth, to finance the women because they are the most vulnerable, and even the indigenous communities like the Ogiek, the Waata who are living in the forest. I think financing those communities and sensitizing them will be very important as we discuss and as we engage in the debate on climate change.
Right, climate positive investment. That's what I'm getting from you there. And when we speak carbon credits, carbon taxation, this kind of, the president is calling it also multilateral financial transactions or taxes. Let's not scare anyone away about taxes. In layman terms, what are these? What are we talking about?
I think all of us Kenyans are discussing the question of taxation, and Kenyans need not to be worried because they are not going to be taxed. But one of the issues about carbon tax is where, for any emission that you engage in, you pay for that tax. So what do you do? So much of what, and I'll discuss it in a very common man's way, where you plant trees, afforestation, and then because you have planted trees, that is a carbon credit. You have reduced the emissions. You have contributed to the reduction of emissions. Okay. So therefore, if you emit, if your industries are emitting, like the US, China, the developed countries, because they are the biggest emitters in terms of carbon dioxide, it therefore means that they are going to be taxed. They will pay for what they have emitted. Okay. For the countries that have not emitted, then they are not going to be taxed. Okay. African countries are not emitters because we only contribute 3 to 4%. So the countries that are going to be taxed or that require to be taxed are the countries that emit more. And we talk about the debate on the polluter pays. The person who pollutes the air is the one that is taxed. That is basically, in a layman's language, what taxation is about. Yes.
All right. These polluters of air and these greatest contributors of pollution, we are engaging with trade with them, right? And in this, green transition, unfortunately or fortunately, so most of the resources which are being used towards even the electric cars that we are seeing, the electric batteries, are resources which are within our continent. We are speaking about the DRC having cobalt and the likes. These are very necessary in this energy, in this green transition that we are currently speaking of. How is it? Will it be possible for us, and I'm trying to get a way where we don't step on anyone's toes here, is it possible for us to participate in trade with this global north, to participate in cooperation towards climate resilience while still protecting our resources from overexploitation, which will still lead to climate change? Is it possible to strike that kind of middle ground?
The African Summit, there was a very serious debate on how do you go green. And you can go green in two ways. One, you can go directly. So you use your renewable energy and you sell it to the outside world. There is the other debate on the trade-off. That for us, who are not big polluters, we will be financed. And therefore, because we are going to be financed, we allow the emitters to continue emitting. The challenge for me is that if we allow the emitters or the polluters to continue polluting, the climate crisis continues. So for me, the biggest solution is to cooperate. And how do we cooperate in building resilience? Is to ensure that all countries, regardless of whether they are in the West or they are in the South or they are in the East or they are in the West, decrease their emissions. And once they have decreased their emissions, then the question of trade-off does not come in. So we go to green energy directly without trading off. Because if we engage in the discussion on trade and trade-off, then we are not dealing with the question of the net zero emissions. The net zero emissions will require that all of us disengage from emission. But if we engage in the question on trade-off, that because African countries are not emitting, therefore there should be investment, or we should sell our energy, then that does not help. At some point, we will also have all our energy depleted. So once all our energy is depleted, then we will go back to square zero. So it becomes a vicious cycle. So the best debate for me is, let us go green directly instead of doing trade.
Right. On a lower level of trade-offs, industrialization. The biggest proponents of industrialization, like Sam Kangara, who normally watches this show, he keeps telling me that we cannot jump, they call it skipping the gun, right? We cannot skip the gun. We cannot go green. We didn't industrialize enough. Is it possible for us to create jobs, empower people, and skip that industrialization phase, which is very fossil fuel intensive, right? You know, these are industries which are run by petrol and whatnot, and the very big emissions. Is it possible for us to empower our economies by jumping that industrialization phase?
Richard, there is no way we are going to jump the industrialization phase. Because if we want to be a middle income economy, industrialization, urbanization, all those are part of the middle income economy. But it does not mean that all industries use fossil fuels. I think what we need to do is to move out of the fossil fuels in our industries to the use of renewable energy. And that is very possible. There are innovations. Our young generations are very innovative. They are coming up with power plants that are using renewable energy that can be used in the industries. So it does not mean that all industries use fossil fuel. We must, as a globe, move away from fossil fuels and adopt the green energy, the renewable energy. And that does not mean we are not going to industrialize. We will industrialize, we will create jobs in the industries using renewable energy.
Right.
Yes.
Collaboration between African countries. I know we have the Africa Free Trade Agreement and a host of other things that we get to discuss with our borders, including the creating of a common currency within the East African market, and also maybe easing of movement of goods here and there. Will this kind of collaboration also help? Are we finally getting that one voice as African Union? We are coming from the first inaugural climate summit. You know, we are there all together. Are we finally moving forward together? Can we trust the African Union?
Richard, the African Union, a summit of African leaders. Africans have spoken with one voice. Whether they spoke with one voice through somebody or not, it was out of a discussion and a deliberation. It is very possible, and Africans are many times building consensus and using dialogue to come up with African solutions, because African solutions is what we need to drive the African economy forward. We can trust the African Union as long as the African leaders are going to commit and are going to honor their commitments to contribute and to finance the African Union. But as long as the African Union is going to be funded and financed by outsiders, then the voices of the Africans are still going to be a bit muted. So if African Union is going to finance itself, then we are going to speak with one voice. But if African leaders, some of them are going to be financed by this ally, the other ally, the other ally, then the challenge comes in, at what point do you now speak with one voice? So speaking with one voice would mean that African leaders commit to the contributions that they have to give to the African Union. Unfortunately, many African countries are debt-ridden. They're thinking about existential issues, food security, and therefore, it becomes very difficult to finance. So as long as the African Union is going to be financed especially by the West, then we still have to rely on the agenda that is driven by the West.
Right. And maybe sometime later in the future, while involving politics and the papers, we'll get to discuss our position on that global table as Africans, and including some others that we cannot get into right now. But today we're speaking advancing green industrialization, financing climate change, and as well as building resilience. On an individual level, is there anything that someone can do, or is this a conversation? There was a very funny video that was out last week of one of our parliamentarians who was reacting to questions on climate change, and they seemed to be caught off guard in that subject. They were not very aware of what kind of conversation is happening at KICC or how, on a personal level, they can contribute. Is there something, as a normal Kenyan who's watching this, can do towards this climate resilience?
Climate justice, the debate on climate justice needs to be advanced by everyone in the African continent. Whether you're a student, whether you are a woman in the village, whether you are a hawker, regardless of what you do, we need to speak and talk about climate justice. Why? Because, as I told you, environmental issues and challenges do not respect anybody. When there is a catastrophe in America, that catastrophe automatically affects the African continent. So as a common person like Okenye, one of the things that you can do is to speak out about climate injustice. Where there is climate injustice, that is something that you need to talk about. If you are in the slums, plant a tree, and that is very important. Once you have cut one tree, plant 5. That in itself is contributing to the debate on climate justice. So each one of us, because all of us are suffering from food insecurity, each one of us can do something. Preserve food using the traditional methods or using the indigenous methods instead of using fossil fuels to preserve your food. So each one of us can engage in a small thing, and that small thing is what is going to contribute to the bigger discussion that is going to be taken up by the African leaders as they meet in Dubai in December 2023 to speak on the one voice for the African continent that will involve, and I pray that that debate and the conclusions and the pronouncements that they are going to make are going to take care of the vulnerable communities, especially the women, the youth, the elderly, and the indigenous communities that are rarely considered when we discuss climate injustice.
Right. Only 7 years are remaining towards us achieving the sustainable development goal of the 2030 agenda. And I want you to note that if you're watching this with concern that 600 million people in Africa still lack access to electricity, while 970 million lack access to clean cooking. I know these are also conversations which have been had in this Africa Climate Summit on how do we, and we've spoken about it here, how do we empower indigenous people and also the vulnerable groups within our community, like the ones who have no access to electricity. How do we make the green transition and help them get these 600 million people in Africa who still lack electricity in 7 years' time to ensure that we are achieving our SDGs. You're a teacher of history, and but we're still having to look towards the future, right? And less to the past, where we are and where we are going to the future. Cognizant of the fact that urbanization, poverty, and inequality are still conversations which are very core to Africa. As you're saying, climate change is the biggest threat, but also those others are also very important discussions. Is there something that you feel could also be included in the next round? This being the inaugural Africa Climate Summit, the second time round when it happens, wherever it will be happening at, what are your expectations, or maybe things you feel like had missed out in this inaugural one that could be included?
Thank you so much, Richard. Yesterday, as I was reading, I don't even think it's yesterday, it's at night, I was reading the newspaper, and the issue of e-cooking is one of the debates that came out of the African Summit, that we need to adopt e-cooking methods. But one of the things that I asked myself is a lot of people in our villages have no electricity. In Kenya, at least, we have a very big number of people that have electricity. But if you go to the Sahel countries, majority of the people are living without electricity. That is regardless of the fact that a lot of these resources that produce electricity are in these countries. And why is this the case? Because a lot of our energy resources are siphoned out by the West, out of the African countries. And that is why the West does not want to leave Africa, because they want to continue siphoning out the resources out of the African continent. So in the future, I foresee a situation where we want to discuss about the role of the West in siphoning resources out of the African continent. That debate will only happen if Africans themselves fund the African summits that are going to come. If we are able to fund them, then we will be able to discuss our problems and get solutions for our own problems in our own way. But as long as we are going to rely on the West, then it becomes a very difficult debate. But I would also want to see more inclusion of the vulnerable groups in these meetings. As much as the African leaders speak for us, we also want to see inclusivity, participatory engagement with the local communities, with the vulnerable groups, with the youth, with the women, so that their voices can also be heard. As I was reading the 18 pronouncement and the 16 others in the Nairobi Declaration, I did not see gender sensitivity in the resolutions that were made. So I would think that in the future, we need to be more inclusive, more engaged in terms of the youth and the more vulnerable communities that are in the local areas.
All right, call to action here. Collective action is required to the global community. I think I had, I liked this part of the Nairobi Declaration, so I'm going to read it out to people who haven't yet grabbed their copy, which is for free online. You can go check it out. We call upon the global community to act with urgency in reducing emissions, fulfilling its obligations, keeping past promises, and supporting the continent in addressing climate change. Specifically to these 4 items, which I'm going to mention here quickly. 1, it will accelerate all efforts to reduce emissions to align with goals set forth in the Paris Agreement. 2, it is to honor the commitment to provide $100 billion in annual climate finance as promised 14 years ago at the Copenhagen conference. Uphold commitments to a fair and accelerated process of phasing down coal and abolishment of all fossil fuel subsidies. And 4th, finally, to swiftly operationalize the loss and damage facility agreed at COP27. Anything notable for you from those 4 very key declarations there for collective action?
Collective action and the need for participation, inclusion, but also the most interesting thing for me is the removal of subsidies on fossil fuels. And that, for me, I feel is the way to go. The debate on trade-off, as I said, is important, but we need to ensure that subsidies are removed on people who are using fossil fuels, and those are not Africans. If we are able to go that direction and we use green energy, renewable energy, then for me, that is the way to go in ensuring that we are having a population in the next 100 years. Otherwise, if we are not able to do that, the biggest polluters who are using fossil fuels, who are still relying on subsidies, will continue, and all of us will have become extinct, because it will not just affect them, it will also affect the African continent.
Right, and reduction of fuel guzzlers by our leaders. Maybe I be petty there for a second. You know, choppers and big vehicles witnessed at this climate summit. I think that will be just my personal note. I don't want to involve Dr. Susan in that one. Thank you very much for having this conversation with us. And maybe anything that we might have left from the African Climate Summit that stood out for you. I think this is the point. This is the time to bring it up.
I think one thing that stood out for me is the fact that the African Summit was a first. One of its kind. It has never happened. A lot of teething issues, but I can tell you, if that happens, that every year the African leaders are meeting to speak with one voice, for me, that is very important for the African continent. Let us meet prior to the COP28, to the COP29, speak with one voice, think about what affects us, and speak with one voice by saying that this is what we think. The recognition of the African continent as having the biggest potential in resolving the climate crisis challenge is the best thing that has been done by our African leaders. And for that, thumbs up to the African leaders.
Yeah, thumbs up to that. And I think also on a patriotic note, this was the first one organized, held in Kenya, Nairobi. The president is the chairperson of the African heads of state and governance in climate change at the African Union. Does that give you some sense of pride?
As a Kenyan, all
Yeah.
Kenyans are proud that the African Summit was held in Nairobi. We are looking forward to many of them being held in Nairobi,
Yes.
because the Nairobi is a green hub, and 93% of our energy is actually renewable.
Yeah.
So for that, and for the Kenyan, any Kenyan, wherever you are, I think we all need to be proud of ourselves.
Right. Yeah, get it. Sense of pride here from Biashara Tuesday. Thank you very much, Dr. Susan, for having this conversation with me. I'm hoping I'll get you another time for that small conversation like this there on the African Union. Right, we're going for a short break, but we'll be right back with more happening here. Engage with us on social media at KUTV Kenya, streaming live YouTube, and also on radio, KU 999 FM, 99.9. That's where you get the audio version of this Biashara Tuesday all the way to 10 in the morning. Don't go too far. I'll be back.
You tryna get that money, say no.